for Jan. So really wonderful that you could make it today. Really, really nice to see you. And also hello to anybody who's watching the recording at a later date. So the topic for this satsang is the Tattvas, 36 principles of reality. So I was looking through my slideshow that I prepared for this satsang earlier this week, and I realized that there is quite a lot of information in here. So as I wrote in the description for this event, it's quite ambitious to try and get through all of the tattvas in one session, actually. So it's very much going to be a whistle-stop tour. Really, to do this topic justice, I mean, you'd have a workshop, or possibly, ideally an entire course devoted to this topic. So just firstly, about the pronunciation of this word. So even though you often see it written with the VA, it's actually pronounced more like tattwa. That's because that particular Sanskrit semi-vowel, the va, becomes pronounced more like a wa when it's after a consonant sound. So that's why we pronounce it as tattvas. And indeed, sometimes you will see it spelt with a W. For example, in all the books by the Bihar Yoga School. So what are the tattvas then? So yes, it's difficult to define the word as this is the case with many other Sanskrit words. The word literally means thatness. And one can also define the tattvas as principles of reality. And of course, that's the definition that I've gone for here in this talk. So different schools of Indian thoughts taught different tattvas, depending on what they considered to be the fundamental principles of reality. So for example, if you look at the Jains or the Buddhists, then they had their own lists of tattvas. But a very well-known tattva scheme or map is that of Sāṃkhya. Now, some people watching this talk may have heard of this word before, this school of thought, this darshana called Sāṃkhya. One of the earliest known systems of Indian philosophy. I can't get into the details of it now, but it is often linked with the school of yoga or classical yoga, because classical yoga drew much of its philosophy from the Sāṃkhya system. So in Sāṃkhya, there was 25 tattvas articulated. So this schema, this map, as it were, was later reworked by the Śaiva Tantrikas, a later group who, as you may know, have a particular interest in. And these Śaiva Tantrikas, they added essentially 11 more tattvas on top, 11 levels of reality, which it claimed that Sāṃkhya had failed to discover. So the tattvas are really central, actually, to yogic and tantric philosophy and cosmology. You can see these as a kind of map of our experience of reality as a conscious being, what it is like to experience reality. So very central, actually, and fundamental. And to have a really good understanding of tantric thought in particular, I would suggest it's essential to have some understanding of these tattvas, because this is where everything really comes together. So the tattvas can be enumerated from the bottom up or from the top down. Yeah. However, I feel that, especially when you're starting off, it makes most sense to explore them from the bottom up, as the lower tattvas, and I always use these scare quotes when I'm saying lower or higher here, because as we will see, they're not really, there's no real lower or higher here in this non-dual tantric view. But anyway, these so-called lower tattvas are quite literally more down to earth. So I feel that they are easier to grasp. As we go up, they become a little bit more abstract and perhaps harder to understand at first. So that's just a broad introduction to the tattvas and what they are. Now the thing about this screen sharing is that I can't see if comments are coming through. I don't think there's any way of doing that whilst sharing the screen as well. But anyway, there's only a couple of you. So if you want to query anything at any point, then do raise your hand. Yeah. And Joe, will you keep a lookout? Yeah. I don't spot it. So I'm just going to have a quick drink of water before we proceed. So we can group these 36 tattvas into groups. And the first group are these elements of materiality, i.e. the elements that comprise the material world. So one expression for this is the Pancha Mahabhutans. Pancha means 5, Maha means great, and bhutas is another word for elements, essentially. So the 5 great elements. So starting off with tattva number 36, the Prithvi tattva, or the earth element. So this is the principle of solidity, density, resistance, groundedness. All 5 senses are engaged in perceiving it. And the bija mantra, that seed syllable that is usually associated with it, is the mantra Lam. long. So in a moment, I'll be showing you some slightly different, much less well-known versions of these seed mantras, but this is the one that's fairly commonly taught, often mistakenly taught as the mantra of the Muladhara chakra, but it's actually the mantra of the earth element, which you can, of course, install into the Muladhara chakra in practice. But the mantra is originally for the element specifically. So you can see this, as I said, as the lowest tattva, but in another sense, from a different perspective, from a tantric perspective in particular, this is the tattva where the universe has manifested itself completely. Yeah, so this tattva kind of contains within it all of the other tattvas that we're about to explore. So in that sense, you could almost see it as the highest, although really, as I said, there's no lowest or highest here. Although, you know, it just seems that way because we're exploring them. We have to explore them in some kind of order. So on the right-hand side of the screen share there, you should be able to see a diagram. And these diagrams, these yantras, is what they are, shapes, are all illustrated by Ekabhumi, who's a tantric artist, amongst other things. And he uses the traditional sources to draw these yantras. So here we have the square, that square that's associated with the earth element. And in this case, you might be able to see those little shapes that surround it. So these are called vajras. So these are symbol. This is a kind of a tantric symbol. So I don't know if you've ever seen me ringing my little bell, and then in the other hand you hold one of these implements. So this is also done in Buddhist Tantra. They hold these like little vajra. The word literally means a thunderbolt. I mean, we have, of course, Vajrasana as a yoga posture. Anyhow, so that's the square, and in the very earliest source that I've seen, it does mention the yellow color. Actually, it does mention the yellow color. Yeah, it does. So yeah, the color traditionally associated is a yellow square. So next we have Tattva 35, the ap or apaha or apas, different variations depending on whether you're speaking in Sanskrit or Vedic Sanskrit, classical Sanskrit, or modern Hindi, different variations. All comes from the same root, however. And that basically means water, the element of water. And this is the principle of liquidity. The senses of hearing, touch, sight, and taste are engaged in perceiving it, especially the latter, that is the sense of taste. And that bija or seed mantra usually associated with it is the mantra Vam. Vam. And the yantra, the shape associated with this element is that crescent moon shape. I believe like a silvery a silvery grey crescent moon. So moving through these first tattvas fairly quickly. So tattva number 34, we have fire. Two possible words for this. We have tejas or agni, both words for fire there. And this is the principle of combustion and transformation. The senses of hearing, touch and sight are engaged in perceiving it, especially the latter, the sense of sight. And the bija mantra associated with this usually is that mantra Ram, Ram. And the yantra is a triangle for sure, a red triangle, usually fiery red triangle. Often in visualization, it's often visualized actually as an inverted triangle. That is a downward facing triangle. And then we have next the Vayu Tattva. Now this is sometimes translated as air, this word, and it can be translated as air. However, another translation which really captures this element better, this principle better, is wind, because this is really the principle of mobility. The senses of hearing and touch are engaged in perceiving it, especially the latter, that is the sense of touch. The bija mantra is yang, yang. And these are, by the way, these mantras are all based on the four, what are called semi-vowels in Sanskrit. So, la, va, ra, ya. So they're actual syllables in the Sanskrit alphabet. And we turn them into a bija mantra essentially by adding that little anuswara sound, anuswara at the end. In English, it's written as an M with a dot underneath it. Yeah, but technically it's not pronounced like in English M. It's more of the anuswara denotes a nasalization sound of the preceding vowel. Yeah, so a little less like yam and more like yang. So next we have Tattva 32, the Akash, or space element. The principle of vacuity and extension. This space provides the context for the manifestation of everything else, of all matter and energy. That is. The sense of hearing is engaged in perceiving it. And the bija mantra here is the mantra Hang. That's another syllable in the Sanskrit alphabet, by the way, the ha sound. And the mantra is Hang. And the yantras there, so the wind element is usually represented by a hexagon shape of a blue grayish color. And as for space, well, a circle is what is mentioned in the text that I've read. I've been doing some research on this online, and I often saw an egg shape for space. But in the text that I've read anyway, what is described as a circle. And in particular in the Bihar books, they talk about a circle that's filled with these, with lots of points of light within it. Yeah, like little pinpoints of light within that black circle. So it's almost like a little mini universe in a way. So anyway, I've just completed a series of 5 classes, and we're doing an extra bonus one next week, where we've been looking at these 5 elements, one per class, in some more detail. So just briefly now, I just wanted to introduce you to these more esoteric versions of these bija mantras, as found in certain texts by a scholar called Christopher Tompkins. So these, as you will see, are slightly different in that instead of using the same vowel, we proceed through the various vowels of the Sanskrit alphabet. That is A, I, U, I, and Au. So in this case, these bija mantras become for earth, Lang for water, Veen for fire, Rung for air, Yang and for space, How. Yeah, so a different teaching. Now, Christopher Tompkins says that the ones that have been passed down to us, the ones that you normally hear, are a result of a mistranslation, and that these are the proper ones. Christopher Wallace, however, another scholar, says that both are valid, and that these are just perhaps slightly more secret, esoteric versions. So to really answer that question, I would have to delve into the ancient texts and scrolls for myself, which I haven't done so far. So anyway, I just wanted to introduce you to those out of interest. Quite a nice little handout that. It shows you of course, also how the mantras look in when they're written in a Sanskrit script, Devanagari script. So if anybody watching this would like to have a closer look at that handout, let me know. So moving onwards. So again, these next groups of tattvas, we're working through them quite quickly. So I want to spend a little bit more time on the higher, so-called higher tattvas. So next we move on to this group of, again, 5, called the subtle elements, the tanmatras. That is to say, the properties of things that make them perceptible by our senses. And you can follow along with this on the diagram as well, I'm provided. Although, please note, it's possible that some of them may have, I don't know, I haven't checked it, but it's possible that some of these tattvas might have different names than what are on this slideshow, because the diagram comes from a different source. So anyhow, this group includes gandha, or odor, rasa, or flavor, rupa, that's appearance or form. We have sparsha, or tactility. Is that what you have there? Touch, yeah. And then shabda, which means sound vibration. So yes, the 5 senses, or rather the properties of things that make them perceptible by the 5 senses, because the 5 senses themselves appear separately. And next we have another group of 5, the karmendriyas, which means the action capacities, roughly, the elements of action. So these are the 5 fundamental functions of a human being in relation to his or her environment. So here we have evacuation, the bowels, reproduction, particularly associated with the genitals. We have locomotion, associated with the feet in particular. Manipulation, associated with the hands. And then we have speech, the action of speech, associated with the mouth. And so quite a thorough map that we're seeing here being described of what it is like to be a human being in the world. So again, moving on briskly, we have the Jnanendriyas, or the sense capacities. So these are the internal correlates of the 5 subtle elements that we looked at previously. These are basically the senses, the five senses. So we have the tattva known as Krana or smell. And then next we have rasana, the sense of taste. And then we have chakshus. Remembering that when you see that CA, then you always know it's actually pronounced cha. And that's the tattva of seeing, sight. And then next we have tvaik, the sense of touch. And then finally in this group, shrotra, the sense of hearing. And so you can see how these groups of 5 are all kind of aligned, and you could actually quite usefully put them into, I haven't done this, but you could quite usefully put them into a table and see how they all link up and correspond with each other. Okay, so we move on now away from these more into a more mental realm. We've gradually proceeded from the grossest elements, the material elements, through to more subtle elements, you may have noticed. And now we come to what we call the inner instruments. So that's an English translation of this Sanskrit phrase, Ahancara, the inner instrument. And this is what altogether we normally refer to as the mind. But here in yogic thought and in tantric thought, we have this very nuanced division of this of the mind, of this inner instrument, into 3 different components. So I think that's right, yeah. Three tattvas making up this inner instrument. So we begin with manas, and this is what we can probably most conveniently translate with the English word mind, because this is what we normally refer to when we say the word mind. And this is referring to the common functional mind that processes and synthesizes the data that's been collected by the senses. Yeah, that is the 5 senses that we've just explored previously in the map, in the list. So that's what manas is. And then next, Tattva 15, we have this thing called the Ahancara. The Ahancara. So you often see this translated as ego. This is like quite a common translation. Now the problem with this translation is that it brings with it, all of these Freudian connotations. But what is meant here is somewhat different, quite different actually to that. So I certainly, and many other scholars say the same thing, prefer to translate this by looking at what it literally means. And what it literally means is the I maker, or the identity constructor. I.e., it is that part of the mind that identifies what is me, mine, and it's that part of the mind that constructs this sense of a separate identity that we know, or that we know if we've studied some yogic philosophy and agree with it, that this is in reality fictitious. So this is what that word really more accurately means, the I maker or identity constructor. And then the third part of this inner instrument, tattva number 14, is the discerning faculty, or the Sanskrit word, the buddhi. So this is the most important mental faculty for all the schools of yoga philosophy. This part of the tattva schema is not by any means unique to Tantric yoga. You find this also in the yoga of Patanjali, in the Yoga Sutras. It's also a key term found in the Bhagavad Gita. So this buddhi is the faculty of reason, the power of imagination, and most importantly for yogis, is the faculty of discernment, by which we decide what is beneficial for our spiritual advancement and what is not. And we've been, as you may know, if you've been attending the Tarka sessions, this faculty of discernment is also known in Tantric yoga as Tarka. It's a limb of yoga. And Abhinavagupta, for those who don't know who Abhinavagupta is, he's one of the leading writers, masters of Tantric thought, Śaiva Tantric thought. And he argues that this limb of discernment, or Tarka, is the highest, actually, of the limbs of yoga. And the most important form of discernment, he tells us, is discerning what is to be held close, upadaya, and what is to be laid aside, here. So the more we practice yoga, the more accurate our intuition and discernment become, at least in theory. The analogy often given is that of polishing a dirty mirror. When through yoga the mirror of the buddhi becomes clear, it can begin to perfectly reflect the light of the divine self. Reflect that inner essence nature. So that's the buddhi tattva. Okay, so now we're getting close to the top of the Sāṃkhya system of tattvas. We get now to those two fundamental principles of the Sāṃkhya system. Some of you have heard of these before, namely Prakriti and Purusha. So first, Prakriti. So often translated as nature or materiality. What English translations like this generally miss is the fact that this term refers not only to the entire universe of matter, but also energy as well. So one translation that I came across that I'm quite fond of in a way is this word that comes from Latin, procreatrix. Now the reason I like this word, well, I just think it's quite a cool word. Also, it comes from the same root, pro and prakriti, so linguistic connection. This word procreatrix, that ending, that trix ending, denotes that this is a feminine word, as in matrix or dominatrix, for example. So that also nicely captures the fact that Prakriti is also a feminine concept. And it gets across this nice idea that what Prakriti is this feminine power of creation. You know, the matrix out of which everything is created. Yeah, so that's why I quite like that word. However, one could argue that if to translate a Sanskrit word, you have to find such an obscure word, then why bother translating it in the first place? Why not just use the original Sanskrit? And that is a good argument too. So when it comes to words like this, Prakriti and Purusha, and many other similar words, once you've got an understanding of the term, because there's often no one English word that can fully capture it. So once you've got an understanding of what the term means, I prefer just to use the Sanskrit word. Anyhow. So Prakriti, one can view this as that unmanifest field or matrix of primordial matter and energy, matter energy, out of which, and by the way, so the yogis and tantrikas had this understanding of matter and energy being intertwined long before the idea became current in modern physics. So, and it's out of this primordial energy matter which all of those lower tattvas, i.e. the ones we've already explored, are created. So there's two different types of Prakriti actually. We have what's called the Mula Prakriti, the root Prakriti, which is unmanifested. And then we have the manifested Prakriti, which is, once everything else has begun to be created, essentially, in short. And Prakriti, keep struggling with that. Prakriti consists of a perfect balance, in its unmanifest form, that is, it's a perfect balance of these three qualities of nature, or the three gunas. So anybody who's had any encounter with yoga philosophy will, this is a concept that of these three gunas that are often come up just in any basic yoga philosophy course or in any teacher training. So these are the principles of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. to put it very briefly, there's that principle of lightness, the principle of fire and dynamism, and then the principle of darkness and inertia. Yeah, that's a rough and ready interpretation of those three gunas. So they're in perfect equilibrium on manifest Prakriti. But then when Prakriti and Purusha first come into their contact, then these three gunas start to recombine in various proportions, and that's what begins to create the lower tattvas, the ones that we've already explored, mixing together essentially in different proportions. So that's Prakriti. So moving on now to what tops the hierarchy in Sāṃkhya and classical yoga, but it's number 12 in this Śaiva Tantric system. And for the Sāṃkhya and yoga, this is the ultimate principle, a transcendent reality that is spirit as opposed to matter energy. So, yeah, pure spirit, or the soul, if you like, as opposed to everything else. So
not consciousness.
Well, in the tantric view, consciousness
is everywhere.
Yes. Yeah, so you wouldn't translate Purusha as consciousness specifically. Because as we will see, consciousness or absolute consciousness comes later on, higher up.
It's beyond.
Yeah, essentially at the top of the, and permeates everything else. So in this view, by the way, I think it's often mistakenly thought that there's just one Purusha. I'm not quite sure where that conception emerged, but if you look at the texts, you'll see that actually there's innumerable Purushas, infinite Purushas, i.e. lots of different souls. Yeah, we've each got our own Purusha inside us. Yeah, so that's what makes it quite different, from the non-dual tantric view as well.
So is Purusha Shiva and Prakriti Shakti? Is it Shiva Shakti dance? Is that why they think there's one Purusha, because it's translated as Shiva?
Could be, yes, but as we will see, Shiva and Shakti, coming up higher up, again higher up in the
Tantra in Sāṃkhya, though, they'd say that would be Shiva Shakti, wouldn't they? In Sāṃkhya philosophy.
Yeah, you could do, yes. I mean, and there are people. I'm sure there are people who who correlate the two with Purusha and Prakriti. I mean, it's certainly if you read the text of Sāṃkhya, they make it very clear that we're looking at a male and a female principle.
I still can't get my head around that there'd be loads of Purushas, and that means there's just one Prakriti. Or is there loads of Prakritis as well?
Well, Prakriti is there's one. There's a Prakriti is
everywhere. She's the procreatrix, so she creates everything.
Yeah, it's like it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Yes. Yeah.
But consciousness is beyond Prakriti. Continue, sorry for interrupting.
No, it's absolutely fine. I mean, I think this can be a cause for some
I remember
confusion.
when we did this before, before in the house and we did Purusha, and you said there's loads of Purusha. I struggled with it then as well. So.
Yes.
Yeah. Continue.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it can be. It's a parallel. You parallel it to, if you like, the Christian concept of soul.
I don't know.
As in, there's lots of there's many, an innumerable number of souls.
Okay.
Okay.
Struggle with Christian. Okay, go for it.
So anyway, from the point of view of tantric philosophy, I mean, this represents a dualism, i.e. this dualism between Purusha and Prakriti. And indeed, I mean, most scholars would agree that Sāṃkhya and classical yoga philosophy are dualistic systems, yeah? In that, the belief is in this two quite separate fundamental principles: matter and energy on the one hand and spirit on the other. So from the point of view then of non-dualist tantrikas, it follows that this Purusha cannot be the highest principle. Rather, they understand Purusha as a contracted form of the universal consciousness. Okay? Maybe this allows you to make a bit more sense of it. It's individuated consciousness.
Like we are.
So you have universal consciousness, but it contracts into
and then it contracts
an individual consciousness.
And then it contracts even further to us. It becomes even more reduced when it gets into human form.
Yeah, through the
No, that's wrong what I said.
Well, through the actions of the mind, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, through the Ahancara.
Yeah.
The I principle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's probably true, yes.
Thank you.
So how does Shiva, i.e. the absolute consciousness, come to manifest itself in the form of an individual like you or me? Well, that's what the rest of the Tattvas set out to describe. So the whole rest of this Tattva map, if you like, is all designed to try and explain why oneness becomes a plurality. Yeah. Why a universe comes into existence at all.
So the cosmology.
Yeah. A cosmology and a psychology, yes. So we start off by looking at the next group of 5. Yeah. Like they're groups of 5. And these are the Kanchikas. So I've been finding these quite interesting recently. So up to this point, we've been proceeding from the bottom up. But it doesn't really make sense to discuss the Kanchikas in this way. So for these Kanchikas, we're going to work top down. So these 5 Kanchikas unfold directly from Tattva number 6, which we will come to shortly, the Maya Tattva. Anyway, so Kanchikas, they're usually discussed, or often discussed as somewhat negatively, as veils that contract Shiva's self-awareness into that of the limited individual, the Jiva, and which thereby conceal the fullness of divine reality. So for example, when I was doing my research into this area, I came across one teacher online who again was using this translation as veil and saying that these Kanchikas are what stop us from seeing the true beauty of reality, of the universe. But I wouldn't necessarily agree with such a statement. Because from another perspective, it's without these Kanchikas, it's these Kanchikas in a way that allow us to see the beauty of the universe. Because without the Kanchikas, there'd be no us, there'd be no seeing, and there'd be no universe. So another translation of Kanchikas, and one that I prefer, is this translation of a shell or an armor. So viewed in this more positive way, these Kanchikas are equipped, in a sense, by Shiva in order to manifest as an embodied sentient being, i.e. like you or me. Otherwise, there'd be no diversity, only a mass of undifferentiated consciousness. Some people might think that's sounds like quite a nice thing, but you know, for most people, I mean, it's nice that we have a diverse universe, even if that includes the good and the bad. So each of these Kanchikas, far from being a negative force, is actually the limited form of a divine power. And we'll see that more clearly as we go through them. So Tattva 7, we have Kala, or the limited power of action. This is the fundamental Kanchika. The others all follow. So this is the divine self-imposed limitation on its power of action, or its Kriya Shakti. So I don't know if you remember, we've talked about the different powers that consciousness has. Yeah? If you were here for the last two talkers, we talked about these 5 Shaktis. Yeah. No, not the cloaks, the Shaktis now, the powers. Yeah. 5 powers of consciousness. And one of these is the Kriya Shakti, the power of action. And the divine, you know, if we're going to call it, you know, that's just one word we can use, the divine, or consciousness, whatever word you'd like to use. So that's the power of being able to do anything. So consciousness has what we call omnipotence. All powerful, the power to potentially do anything. However, as limited beings, we cannot do everything. Without this Kala, without this limited power of action, we couldn't do anything. So it's a limited power of action. You're looking confused.
But that's because we've been cloaked. We're wearing a shell. Can we not get rid of our shells?
Well, we can connect with, we can connect with higher levels, yes, of consciousness. Yeah. But we still have to to live in the world. To live in the world, yeah. We need these limits, you know, we live with these limited powers. So next we have what's called Vidya, the limited power of knowledge, incomplete knowledge, a limited form of the divine power of knowing, or Jnana Shakti, or omniscience is the word, the English word that we have that most closely corresponds to that. Now, so the problem, or so-called problem, of this Kanchika is not that we know nothing, but that we know a little bit, And then we often mistakenly think that is all that there is to know. So this is a recurrent problem that we face. And we see it exhibited quite a lot. So that's the power of knowing. So next we have the raga tattva, and this word can be translated as desire. And this is a limited form of the divine power of will. That is the Icha Shakti. The deep impulse to express the fullness of our authentic being. So when the fully expanded consciousness contracts itself into the form of an individual, then it necessarily begins to experience itself. We experience ourselves as incomplete or imperfect, and therefore begins to desire whatever it thinks it needs for completion, be it money, power, fame, love, sex, or even spiritual experiences. Yeah. Sometimes people can become even attached and addicted to having certain spiritual experiences and craving them to make them feel, that feeling of wanting to feel more complete. It can take many different forms. And this kind of desire is called raga. But according to this train of thought, the school of thoughts, in fact, all craving underneath is truly craving for only one thing. That's that fullness of divine consciousness. And this what leads us to this tantric view that desire is not a problem, but an opportunity. An opportunity to follow the desire back to the source and realize that what we really crave is that fullness and wholeness. And it just made me think of the mantra, Om Puna Madaha Puna Midam. This is full, that is full. I can't remember the full.
From fullness
mantra.
Comes fear.
Yes, that mantra. So that's why I put that there. It just reminded me of that mantra. So this is, of course, one of the features that makes tantric yoga. It makes tantric yoga, distinct from the more classical yoga associated with Patanjali, or indeed any other more ascetic style of yoga, where desires are often seen as are generally seen as a problem and a drawback for our spiritual advancement. But in Tantra, at least in this, when I say Tantra, you know that, well, I mean the left-handed forms of Tantra. Desire is seen as an opportunity, really. So we, to an extent, embrace and work with our desires.
You have to have some sort of level of maturity to desire, because I do understand why Patanjali, like to declutter and not have like loads of things, because they can become distractions, can't they? So to be able to be on a spiritual path where you desire all these different things, don't you have to have like a certain level of maturity? Because can't you go like a bit overboard? I know for me, like the whole Patanjali thing of, downsizing and getting rid of stuff, I found that really helpful, because then I probably would have just kept on craving all these other things. I guess you have to be quite a strong person to be able to follow.
Yeah, maybe it's just again a matter of the path that suits one person might be different. But what suits another.
I do get like how, like the reason why we desire, we crave all these things, like going out, drinking, getting all the things or whatever, is because we feel incomplete inside, and what we're longing to is to get back to the source. But also, yeah, so, but also, I do think as well that if you're not aware, then having a little bit of restriction, a little bit of tapas is quite good as well, isn't it?
Yes, well, I'm not suggesting that they're saying that they're arguing here for a full out
hedonistic lifestyle.
I wish now that I came across I wish I'd just, I thought on and printed it out or something. There's no way I can access it now. Came across an excellent, really interesting little quote from one of the Krama texts. The Krama is like the most radical kind of left-handed school of Tantra. Yeah. Okay. About why it was essentially saying why, at least at the start of the spiritual path, that you shouldn't stop people from indulging in alcohol and meat, etc., because that's just likely to turn them off the path.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That's what essentially the passage was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I just thought it was for a 10th century, 11th century text, it was quite interesting.
Can I say something?
Yes, of course.
It does actually say in Tantra Illuminated, and I'm going to read it now. In the mythological tales, even Lord Shiva had an addiction to gambling and wine, a craving that he transformed into an addiction to shattering the fear of all beings in all worlds. The first step in such transmutation is tracing desire back to its source and realizing your longing for divine fullness, letting that longing soften your heart and compel you to seek true connection to the One.
Yeah.
So.
Oh no, Shiva was, big pot smoker, had depression. I love Shiva. He was great. Or he is great. Cut off his son's head. Bloody fantastic.
Yeah, and praying, of course, in many of the stories, getting very angry.
Yeah, getting angry. He let his wife burn herself to death. He's wonderful, is Shiva.
Really good
rock and roll, Tracy.
He is rock and roll, isn't he? It's Keith Richards on speed. Sorry, I'll mute myself.
No, that's brilliant.
Yeah. So shall we move on? Yeah. So hopefully we should be able to get through all of the tattvas in this session. So next we have we're still with the Kanchikas here, and next we have Kala. So just briefly notice another instance of how important it is to have the little diacritics, because without them the word would look the same for the Tattva 7, which is Kala, with a long R at the end, and Kala, which is time. So this is the fourth of these veils or armors, whichever you prefer. So the divine is omnitemporal. It's in all times, at the same time. So instead of this timeless simultaneity of absolute consciousness, where everything's happening together and there's no real time, embodied beings like us experience time as this slow crawl of 1 second per second. And this means that we experience time sequentially, with one thing following another in a process of continual change. And this can, of course, be a source of much suffering, as we thereby experience much decay and loss, and also worry about what's going to happen next in that timeline. A more accurate perspective would be to accept that there is no future or past per se, but only a constantly flowing present. In this way, we can become free of the net of time, entering into eternally flowing simultaneity, or the Sanskrit word nityodita. So I did a class that was connected with this a little while ago, and there I brought up this, this modern physics notion of the block universe, and the idea in that model, everything in the past and the future is all happening together. So this again is another idea that's by no means limited to Tantra. It's also a pretty mainstream view, actually, in modern physics. So next we have Nyati, or the Tattva of causality. So in the tradition, this is seen as the force that binds us to our karmas. Basically, it's the law of cause and effect. When we learn to perform actions as service or sacrifice, which of course is taught in a text such as the Gita as well, investing in the process but unattached to the final outcome, these actions have no karmic charge and therefore do not bind us. So this tattva, this Nyati, is also associated with a specific place, desha. That is, you and I can only be in one place at a time, I believe, unless you've really developed your yogic superpowers. Unlike absolute consciousness, which is all pervasive and omnipresent. Is that clear enough? Fairly clear? Yeah. So having explored those Kanchikas, we now again move onwards to Tattva number 6. Maya. So it's pronounced with 2 long R's, Maya. So now we've come to the top of that hierarchy of manifest reality. Everything above this is describing ultimate reality. Yeah, so this word Maya usually gets translated as illusion. And this might be appropriate in other traditions. For example, in Advaita Vedanta, for example, illusion is, might be an appropriate way to translate the word in that tradition. But in non-dual Tantra, that is off the mark. Because we're not talking really about illusion. It's the same as I did when I was talking about the Kanchikas. You can see them in a negative way, or you can also see them in a more positive way. The same is true with Maya. Maya is the world's source in this tradition. That is the divine's power to project itself into manifestation and create this diverse, manifold universe of which we are a part. Doing so via those Kanchikas which we've just explored. It's the very power that creates this manifest universe as we know it. So thus, Maya is not given a negative valuation in the Tantra, even though it does, in a sense, delude us into seeing duality, where there is only unity, really. For seeing dualistically is a necessary part of the process of self-exploration that the divine has freely chosen by manifesting a universe in the first place. So that's the view, and we can discuss it. People would wish to. This idea that for its own free will, Icha Shakti, the divine chooses to contract itself into individuals so that it can then come back to realize itself as consciousness. So the next layer of tattvas is called the Shuddhadvan. Shuddhadvan, the pure universe. And this comprises those top 5 tattvas that describe the divine reality that pervades the whole of the manifest universe. So the differences between these tattvas are really differences of perspective and emphasis, really. Yeah, because they're all basically ways of describing ultimate reality. So you can't say that one's necessarily any higher than another. They're just different perspectives, different emphasis. To reach any of these 5 tattvas is to attain complete liberation and awakening in the tradition. So we have Shuddha Vidya, or pure mantra wisdom. So this is the level of wisdom and of mantra. So it's a little known fact that besides meaning wisdom, Vidya is also a feminine word for mantra. And both meanings are at work here, or at play here. The wisdom spoken of here is not any type of intellectual knowledge, but rather the various phases of Shiva Shakti's self-awareness expressed in the form of all the 70 million mantras that are said to exist. So one who reaches liberation on this level is one who sees the entire universe as a diverse array of energies, but with a single essence. So experiencing everything as interacting patterns of vibration.
So that's Spanda Yoga.
Yes. I would say that is essentially Spanda Yoga, yes.
And string theory and quantum physics.
You could expand it to that, yes. Although, yeah, string theory is not.
I know it's a theory.
It's struggling a bit, isn't it? As unfortunately as a theory.
But it's based on everything having a vibration.
Yeah.
They just can't prove it.
Yeah. So yeah, that's awakening on that level is that experiencing of everything as these patterns of varying patterns of vibration. And it's also the level, as I've said, of mantra. So another aspect is this Tattva of Ishwara. So this word Ishwara also comes into the Yoga Sutras and other texts as well, although it's not there listed as one of the tattvas. So this is normally translated as Lord. Now, that's the most common translation. It's essentially a generic, non-sectarian name for a personal God. Yeah, so if you're writing, but not writing about any God or any deity specifically, then one uses this word Ishwara. And this is the level then of the personal God, a God as a being with specific qualities. And this is the level of realities that most mainstream monotheistic religions, such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, for example, those religions presume to be the highest. But it's really just one aspect, as it were, in this view. So, Tattva number 3, Sada Shiva, or we can call this the ever benevolent one. So the word God is really no longer applicable here. For this level, really transcends any form of a deity, of identifiable names or attributes. This is the level on which only the slightest subtle differentiation has just begun to emerge between the absolute consciousness and the idea of the universe that is to be manifested. So just that very first faint ripple, if you will, when the very faintest idea of a universe is beginning to be birthed. Abhinavagupta tells us that the divine at this level is called Sadha Shiva, eternally Shiva, to remind us that even as a universe begins to come into being, a universe, so not just this one, but potentially many different universes, the Absolute loses none of its divinity. It is still Shiva, still blessed, even as it manifests, and begins its journey of manifesting into that universe. So here we are, we're getting towards the top, or as I said, the so-called top of the hierarchy. Shakti and Shiva. So first we look at Shakti, but the word Shakti literally means power, potency, energy, capacity, capability, all potential parts of a translation. In non-dual Śaiva Tantra, all powers are worshipped as goddesses, or rather as forms of the goddess, Mahadevi. According to this non-dual strand of Tantra, Shiva and Shakti are two sides of the same coin. You can't talk about one without also talking about the other. And Shakti can be no more separated from Shiva than heat can be separated from fire. And not necessarily the case in other strands of Tantra, by the way. This is just the case in non-dual Tantra. All forms of energy are Shakti, and since matter is energy, as the Tantrikas well knew, the whole manifest universe is seen as the body of the goddess, and the movements of all forms of energy are her dance. So that's Shakti. And then moving on to Tattva number 1, Shiva. Now the word Shiva, as you may or may not know, literally translates as auspicious, good or benevolent, something along those lines. We've already talked about Shiva as you know, that personified deity. Sometimes in deep meditation, other times getting into a bit of a temper. But in the context of non-dual Shaiva Tantra, Shiva is not the name of a god, rather this word is understood to signify the peaceful, quiescent ground of all reality. So the contrast here is, while Shakti is extraversive, immanent, manifest, omniform and dynamic, Shiva is introversive, transcendent, unmanifest, formless and still. And this word Shiva is traditionally interpreted as that in which all things lie. Thus Shiva is the ground of being, that which gives reality its coherence. His nature is beyond any qualities and is therefore difficult to express in words. So some people may well say here, well, is there not still a duality at play here then? A duality, that is, between Shiva and Shakti. Have we really got that much further than we did with Purusha and Prakriti? And indeed, the non-dualist authors, such as Abhinavagupta, for sure, and his students, saw that. And that's why they actually added an extra tattva, the one that we're calling Tattva 0. Is that on your little?
No. Is it Paramashiva?
Yes, I think that's what they're referring to on that diagram as Paramashiva. Yes. Now the thing about this tattva is you know, I mean, how can you give it a name at all? But the words that, so the tattva is taught, as I've already said this, in the esoteric non-dual traditions. It is 0 because it does not really crown the hierarchy. It is that which simultaneously transcends and encompasses all things. Yeah. Everything that we've looked at so far.
Before what we call the Big Bang was the heart.
Well, I haven't really thought about it like that, but
no.
Yeah, I suppose you could look at it like that.
Well, it's a cosmology, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you not do an analogous to modern cosmologies?
Not really, no.
No.
But you can, I suppose you could usefully do that.
Mm.
So this absolute principle pervades the whole as the indefinable essence of all things, both manifest and unmanifest. It is incomprehensible by the conceptual mind, really. So this Abhinavagupta's lineage often calls it the heart, Hridaya. But it goes by many other names as well. There's no single name can fully express it. And in the tradition, this is what's known also as the doctrine of higher non-duality, or Paramadvaya, which subsumes both duality and the ordinary non-duality. It is all-encompassing this, because it includes even duality as a level within the real. Whereas ordinary non-duality, for example, in classical Advaita Vedanta, has a tendency to simply negate duality as wrong or false. It's an illusion. So this tradition tries to embrace within itself duality. So all-encompassing in that way. So I think this quote is one that we already looked at in our last talker group. So worth just having another explore of it. This is what Abhinavagupta has to say about this tattva. This whole universe is one reality, unbroken by time, uncircumscribed by space, unclouded by attributes, unconfined by forms, inexpressible by words, and impossible to understand with the ordinary means of knowledge. And of course, his work, the Tantra Sara, which we're investigating in those groups, is where he charts essentially the different ways, the different paths from which we can come to realize and fully that one reality.
So if there's multiverses, would the heart encompass all the multiverses then? Or would each multiverse?
No.
Are they all separate systems then?
No, because then because then it wouldn't be it would be
dualistic then.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So non-duality means non-duality. So whatever exists, no matter how many multiverses there is.
So why did they bring God in so early on then? Ishvara. Why does Christianity not and Judaism not think that God is the heart? Why is God limited?
Yes. I thought somebody was muted then.
I am muted. I'm muted.
Tracy?
Because they're worshipping that thing, aren't they? That's what they think they're worshipping. They're not. Hard to explain, isn't it?
Well, in more mystical forms of those religions, they do come to that understanding, don't
Like
they?
Sufism.
So, the Gnostic teachings and the
Sufism.
Sufism.
The Sufis, they have all that heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they came to this understanding too. Yeah.
Okay.
But in the more traditional forms of the religion, yes, they might talk about, they might link God with the heart, but they still see it as a separate thing.
That's their Tanya. It's not inside. The difference is that they don't think God is inside us, isn't it? In Christianity, it's something out there. Whereas in Tantra, God is, we are God, aren't we?
Yes.
No?
Yeah, very much so.
I don't like using that word still. I find it really hard because of all my conditioning. Don't know if anyone else finds that.
I think that too, because you do automatically think of another, of this being, don't you, that is separate from everything.
What about the word divine?
Energy, consciousness. I like those words, more neutral.
Definitely.
I always still get prickly as soon as I saw the word God. I wanted to walk. I had to no, it's okay.
Oh,
It's really interesting watching myself how prickly I get.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, maybe you need some to uncondition.
I do need to uncondition that word, definitely. I grew up in a Greek Orthodox family.
No, I get that totally.
Yeah. So I mean, it's completely up to the individual practitioner to the extent that they want to, worship an actual deity as part of their practice. For some people, it's certainly not. It can be a part of a non-dualist practice to still use a deity. Many people find it very helpful.
Many people do, yeah.
So, we talked, about the theory of tattvas in great detail in this talk. But what consequences does it have for practice? Can we work with tattvas in our practice? So, the answer is yes, we certainly can. In the very earliest tantric text that's been translated, I've got a copy of that translation. For example, it's a large text, and it's almost completely all about the tattvas, and how the tantric initiate was to use those in their practice. So we have a classical tantric practice called tattva shuddhi, or purifying of the tattvas. And this can take a slightly different form depending on the text and on the tradition. And just on that note, by the way, the whole tattva scheme that I've just described, is also interpreted in different ways in different traditions. There's not just one monolithic view. The view that I've just communicated to you is very much, that of the non-dualist, the Trika lineage in particular, of Abhinavagupta. Anyway, so this practice is alluded to in the text known as the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. Some of you may have heard of that one. It's the most well-known tantra out there. And the practice in question goes as follows: meditating on the principles of reality, the tattvas, dissolving each more subtle than the last in one's own body or in the world, the supreme goddess, Para, manifests in the end. So it alludes to the practice, but obviously doesn't describe it. One form that's taught today still is that of the Bihar school. And indeed, they've published a whole book about it. Tattva Shuddhi by Swami Satya Sangananda. Worth having a look at. And it's also sometimes taught by Swami Nishalananda of Mandala Ashram in Wales. And indeed, you can find a recording of that. You go to Bandcamp, there's a recording. I must admit that I myself haven't been initiated into this practice. I would quite like to then. Out of all the, it's one course I would like to do at Mandala Ashram the next time it's ever run there. I'm not aware of any other traditions who teach that practice. I mean, it's possible that Harish Wallace might be able to teach a form of the practice. He certainly teaches a form of it where you just go through those first 5 tattvas. He does that version of the practice. But yes, it's an area that I'd very much like to explore a little more deeply, certainly in terms of practice. So that's really the end of the talk that I have prepared. So I'd like to invite any questions now or points for further discussion. Then we can stop the screen share now.